Hey everyone, tonight we dim the lights and settle in for a journey back to ancient Rome, where the weight of an empire rested not just on the shoulders of its emperors, but often heavily on their eyelids. You're about to discover that even with all the power, all the gold, all the legions at their command, Roman emperors faced a particularly insidious enemy: insomnia. Imagine, if you will, the vastness of that world, the endless responsibilities, the constant threat of betrayal, all pressing down on a single mind as the city outside finally hushed. You probably won't survive this mental exercise with your own restful sleep intact, so consider yourself warned. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now in the comments. And if you're enjoying this, like and follow the channel to keep waiting for the next exciting parts. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. From the very moment the Roman Republic transitioned into an empire, the job description for the man at the top changed dramatically. No longer just a consul serving for a year, you as the emperor became the living embodiment of Rome, its protector, its provider, its ultimate judge. And with that unimaginable power came an equally unimaginable burden. Think of it: every decision, every minor skirmish on a distant border, every whispered conspiracy in the forum, all of it funneled up to you. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose while simultaneously juggling flaming torches, all under the scrutinizing gaze of millions. Take Augustus, for instance, the very first emperor, the one who famously claimed he found Rome brick and left it marble. Sounds grand, right? But behind that monumental legacy was a man plagued by a deep-seated anxiety that stemmed directly from his rise to power. You see, the Republic had been torn apart by decades of civil war, a bloody, brutal period where allegiance shifted like desert sands, and tomorrow was never promised. Augustus, then known as Octavian, navigated these treacherous waters with ruthless cunning, ultimately defeating his rivals, including the charismatic Mark Antony and the formidable Cleopatra. But those years of constant struggle, the betrayals, the battles, they left an indelible mark. It's not something you just shake off like a bad dream. Historians still argue whether Augustus genuinely desired to restore the Republic, or if his pronouncements were simply clever propaganda to consolidate his sole rule. What's clear, however, is that he understood the precariousness of his position. You as Augustus would have carried the trauma of those civil wars in your very bones. Every night, as the city grew quiet, your mind would replay the faces of fallen comrades, the cries of battle, the political machinations that could at any moment unravel everything you'd built. There was no comfortable off switch for an emperor. The threat of assassination wasn't a distant possibility. It was a daily reality, a shadow lurking in every corner of your palace. Even the food you ate, the wine you drank. Was it safe? You'd have trusted only a select few. And even then, trust was a fragile, fleeting thing in the cutthroat world of Roman politics. It's a bit like having that one work colleague who constantly forgets to mute themselves on Zoom calls, but instead of annoying chatter, it's the constant threat of a poison goblet. Consider the physical toll, too. Augustus, despite his long reign, was often in delicate health. He suffered from various ailments, including a weak stomach and bladder issues. These physical discomforts, combined with the immense mental strain, created a perfect storm for chronic sleeplessness. Imagine trying to strategize the governance of an entire empire while battling indigestion and the nagging fear that someone is sharpening a dagger with your name on it. It's not exactly conducive to counting sheep, is it? He knew firsthand the bitter taste of betrayal, having seen Caesar, his adoptive father, struck down by trusted senators. That memory, that vivid image of sudden violent death, must have haunted his quiet hours, turning every rustle outside his bedroom door into a potential threat. You'd find yourself jumping at shadows, replaying conversations, searching for hidden meanings in every glance. Even the most secure palace in the world couldn't entirely shield you from the demons of your own mind. The weight of absolute power, it turns out, is an incredibly heavy blanket, suffocating rather than comforting. Even with Augustus's careful succession planning, the transition to Tiberius was far from smooth, and his reign would be defined by a growing sense of isolation, and you guessed it, a profound lack of sleep. Imagine stepping into the shoes of the most powerful man in the world, not with ambition, but with a deep-seated reluctance. Tiberius had spent years in military campaigns, a successful general, but the intricate, often duplicitous world of Roman politics was a different beast entirely. You'd feel the weight of expectation, the whispers of dissent, the constant comparison to your illustrious predecessor. It's like being the lead singer who replaced a legend. Everyone's just waiting for you to hit a bad note. Tiberius's natural inclination was towards introversion, a trait ill-suited for the performative role of emperor. He was a man of keen intellect, but also of deep suspicion. As the years wore on, this suspicion festered, turning into full-blown paranoia. You'd lie awake night after night, replaying conversations, dissecting every glance, every hesitant word. Who was truly loyal? Who was plotting your downfall? The vastness of Rome, with its millions of inhabitants, suddenly felt like a labyrinth of potential enemies. Every creak of the palace, every shadow dancing in the moonlight would become a source of dread. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life, perhaps tending a vineyard in the countryside, far from the madding crowd. His growing paranoia ultimately led him to withdraw from Rome altogether, famously retreating to the island of Hamanoan, Capri, June 26 AD. This wasn't a vacation, not really. While ancient sources paint a lurid picture of debauchery and cruelty on the island, what's often overlooked is the profound loneliness and mental torment that must have accompanied such an isolation. You as Tiberius would have been surrounded by a small hand-picked retinue, but even they couldn't be entirely trusted. The sea, which once offered a sense of freedom, now became a barrier, both protecting you and trapping you. Every dispatch from Rome, every messenger arriving on the shore, would carry the potential for catastrophic news. Historians still argue whether Tiberius's retreat to Capri was a strategic move to better control the empire from a distance, or simply an escape from the overwhelming pressures of the capital. Regardless of his initial motivations, the isolation only amplified his sleeplessness. The nights on Capri, while perhaps physically quiet, would have been deafeningly loud in your mind. The lack of direct engagement with the daily affairs of the city meant that every rumor, every piece of gossip would be magnified, distorted by distance and fear. You'd probably pace your villa, the marble cool beneath your bare feet, watching the moon cast long shadows over the Bay of Naples. The only sounds might be the lapping of waves against the shore, or perhaps the distant cry of a night bird. Sounds that in your state of heightened anxiety would become sinister. Imagine sending out orders from your secluded island, knowing that the loyalty of those executing them was always in question. The powerful Praetorian prefect Sejanus, whom Tiberius had left in charge in Rome, became increasingly influential, fostering the emperor's paranoia by feeding him information often distorted about supposed plots. You'd probably find yourself caught in a dreadful feedback loop. Your paranoia would lead you to trust fewer people, which would then make you more paranoid about the few you did trust. It's like when you're absolutely convinced you left the stove on after leaving the house, and the only way to check is to drive all the way back. Except for Tiberius, the stove was always potentially on, and the house was the entire Roman Empire. This constant mental strain would have manifested physically. You'd look haggard, your eyes perpetually shadowed, your demeanor increasingly morose. Sleep, when it came, would be fitful, haunted by vivid, unsettling dreams. The luxurious villas on Capri, designed for pleasure and relaxation, became gilded cages for a mind tormented by suspicion and the immense crushing weight of an empire you both ruled and feared. There was no escaping the burden, not even on a beautiful island paradise. If Tiberius was plagued by suspicion and isolation, his successor, Caligula, took the imperial sleeplessness to an entirely new, terrifying level. Imagine inheriting not just an empire, but also a predisposition for mental instability, perhaps even exacerbated by the very environment you were raised in. You as Caligula would have been surrounded by the dark, paranoid atmosphere of Tiberius's court on Capri, witnessing firsthand the brutal purges and arbitrary executions. It's like growing up in a haunted house. Eventually, the ghosts start whispering to you too. Initially, Caligula was hailed as a breath of fresh air, a generous and popular ruler. But this honeymoon period was incredibly short-lived. A severe illness early in his reign seemed to fundamentally alter his personality, transforming him from a promising young emperor into a capricious tyrant infamous for his cruelty and bizarre antics. This shift, you might imagine, wasn't just a matter of changing moods. It deeply impacted his knights. Historians still argue whether Caligula's madness was the result of a physical illness, a pre-existing psychological condition, or simply the corrupting influence of absolute power. What's clear is that his internal turmoil made restful sleep a near impossibility. You'd find yourself in the grip of night terrors. Not just bad dreams, but vivid, horrifying experiences that would jolt you awake, heart-pounding, drenched in sweat. These wouldn't be the occasional nightmare. They would be a recurring, relentless onslaught, a waking hell within the darkness of your own bedchamber. Perhaps you'd see the faces of those you'd condemn, their pleading eyes, their silent accusations. Or maybe you'd envision plots against your own life, daggers glinting in the dark shadows moving in your periphery. The line between reality and nightmare would blur, making it impossible to truly relax even when you were supposedly safe within the heavily guarded imperial palace. Caligula famously claimed to be unable to sleep at night, often pacing the long corridors of his palace, calling out to the dawn, pleading for its arrival. You can almost picture him, a solitary, agitated figure, wandering through lavish halls surrounded by silent guards who dared not meet his gaze. What thoughts tormented him during those endless hours? Was it the memory of some heinous act committed during the day, or the planning of some new outrageous scheme for the morrow? Perhaps both. It's like that feeling when you're so anxious about something you just can't switch off your brain, but dialed up to an imperial level with the fate of millions hanging in the balance. His erratic behavior during the day, his declaring himself a god, his attempts to make his horse a consul, his outlandish construction projects can be seen as symptoms of a mind unmoored, possibly exacerbated by chronic sleep deprivation. A person who hasn't slept properly for days or weeks becomes irritable, impulsive, prone to hallucinations and irrational decisions. You'd find your judgment impaired, your self-control eroded, your capacity for empathy withered. The very real power you wielded, combined with a severely sleep-deprived and possibly deranged mind, created a truly terrifying combination for the Roman people. One quirky tidbit about Caligula is his supposed love for a particular type of golden-haired horse, Insecurity, for whom he planned elaborate stables and even a marble stall. While this might seem humorous, it also suggests a retreat into a world of personal obsessions, perhaps a desperate attempt to find solace or control in a reality that was rapidly spiraling. For you, the emperor, even these personal quirks would be tinged with the weight of your office. Could this horse offer him the unconditional acceptance he couldn't find among his human subjects, who surely feared his unpredictable nature? When you can't trust your advisors, your family, or even your own thoughts, sometimes a loyal, if somewhat clueless horse is the only company you can bear. And even then, true rest would remain elusive, banished by the specter of your own terrifying mind. After the madness of Caligula, you might think the Romans and their new emperor would crave peace and order, and they got it in a way with Claudius. But don't mistake his scholarly demeanor and occasional physical infirmities for a lack of imperial anxieties. In fact, his struggles with sleep were likely rooted in a different, perhaps more insidious form of stress, the constant threat of being underestimated, ridiculed, or simply disposed of. It's like being the quiet, nerdy kid who suddenly gets put in charge of the entire school. Everyone's watching, waiting for you to trip. Claudius, you see, was no one's first choice for emperor. He was known for a limp, a stammer, and various nervous tics, which led his family to largely dismiss him as an intellectual recluse, unfit for public life. This perceived weakness, however, became his unlikely shield, protecting him from the purges that decimated the rest of his family under Tiberius and Caligula. But once the Praetorian Guard, almost as a joke, dragged him out from behind a curtain and declared him emperor, that shield vanished. Suddenly you, as Claudius, would be acutely aware that everyone around you, from the senators to your own household, had initially dismissed you. This would breed a deep-seated insecurity, a constant feeling of needing to prove yourself even as you navigated the treacherous waters of imperial power. Imagine lying in your opulent bed, the very bed from which your nephew Caligula had recently been dragged and murdered, knowing that your life now depended on your ability to outmaneuver those who viewed you as a weakling. You'd replay every conversation and every court intrigue, wondering if you'd missed a subtle slight, a hidden threat. This wasn't the overt paranoid fear of Tiberius or the psychotic terrors of Caligula. It was a quieter, more gnawing anxiety. It's the feeling you get when you're in a room full of people and you suspect they're all talking about you behind your back. Except in your case, their whispers could lead to your assassination. A mainstream historical fact about Claudius is his significant administrative reforms and his successful conquest of Britain. He genuinely worked hard overseeing the construction of new roads, aqueducts, and ports. These massive undertakings, while beneficial to the empire, would have consumed your days and gnawed at your nights. The logistics alone, the sheer scale of the projects would be enough to keep anyone awake. You'd be worrying about supplies, labor funding, all while simultaneously managing the vast bureaucracy of Rome and plotting military campaigns on distant shores. The quirky tidbit about Claudius is his fascination with history and scholarship. He was a prolific writer, even attempting to reform the Latin alphabet by adding 3 new letters, though they didn't catch on, bless his heart. You can picture him in the dead of night, unable to sleep, perhaps reaching for a scroll, delving into historical texts, finding solace in the intellectual pursuits that had always been his refuge. But even this scholarly escape would likely be punctuated by sudden anxieties about his reign, his family, his legacy. Historians still argue whether Claudius's physical infirmities were genuine handicaps or if he cleverly exaggerated them to appear harmless and avoid political suspicion. If the latter, it was a dangerous game to play and one that would have kept him perpetually on edge. His wives, particularly the ambitious Messalina and later Agrippina the Younger, also contributed significantly to his sleepless nights. Messalina's scandalous affairs and plots would have been a constant source of public humiliation and private terror. You'd be torn between loyalty and the brutal reality of Roman politics, where a compromised emperor was a dead emperor. The domestic sphere, which for many provides a sanctuary, was for Claudius another arena of dangerous power struggles. The weight of his responsibilities combined with his personal vulnerabilities made restful sleep a rare luxury, snatched only between bouts of worry and the endless demands of his unexpected imperial role. If Claudius was an unexpected emperor, his successor, Nero, was groomed for the role, albeit with disastrous results for his sleep and everyone else's. Imagine being a young man adopted by the emperor, with the weight of the world essentially handed to you on a silver platter. You'd expect privilege and ease, but what Nero found was a vortex of artistic ambition, political machinations, and increasingly the self-inflicted wounds of a conscience, battling its own darkness. It's like being given the keys to the kingdom, only to find the kingdom is on a rapidly deflating bouncy castle. Nero's early reign was largely managed by capable advisors like Seneca and Burrus, but as he matured, his true passions emerged, not governance, but art, music, and performance. He saw himself as a grand artist, a divine singer, a chariot racer of unparalleled skill. While this might sound like a fun hobby for an emperor, these pursuits became obsessions, often taking precedence over affairs of state. You'd find yourself spending hours practicing the lyre, composing epic poems, or training for chariot races, all while the empire hummed or grumbled in the background. This relentless pursuit of artistic glory, combined with the pressures of being an emperor, created a unique form of imperial sleeplessness. Think about it, the sheer anxiety of performance. Nero didn't just sing for his friends, he performed for vast audiences, meticulously staging his appearances. You'd be worried about hitting the right note, about the crowd's reaction, about rival artists. Yes, emperors had rival artists. The night before a major performance, you as Nero would likely be a bundle of nerves, replaying melodies in your head, tweaking lyrics, agonizing over costumes. It's the kind of sleeplessness an actor or musician experiences before opening night, but magnified by the fact that your audience literally controlled your life. A bad performance could not only damage your reputation, but also embolden your political enemies. A mainstream historical fact about Nero is the Great Fire of Rome. In 64 AD, a catastrophic blaze that devastated much of the city. While historians still debate Nero's role in starting the fire, some accuse him, others say he responded effectively. The aftermath certainly contributed to his troubled nights. The immense task of rebuilding the public outcry, the search for scapegoats which famously led to the persecution of Christians, all these pressures would have been immense. You'd be facing widespread discontent, your popularity plummeting, your grip on power, feeling increasingly tenuous. It's one thing to worry about art, another entirely, to worry about an entire city reduced to ashes. The quirky tidbit about Nero is his invention of a new type of musical instrument, a kind of water organ, and his enthusiasm for designing innovative theatrical machinery. This passion for invention, while fascinating, also speaks to a mind that struggled to disengage. Even in his leisure, he was consumed by projects, by the desire to create and impress. You can imagine him late at night tinkering with designs lost in his artistic world, perhaps using it as a deliberate distraction from the growing unrest and the whispers of conspiracy that surrounded him. Historians still argue whether Nero's artistic pursuits were a genuine expression of his personality or a deliberate attempt to deflect attention from his tyrannical tendencies. As his reign spiraled into increasing cruelty and paranoia, marked by the murder of his mother Agrippina and his wife Octavia, and the forced suicides of prominent figures like Seneca, his sleeplessness would have taken on a darker hue. The artistic anxieties would have been replaced, or at least joined, by the chilling dread of a guilty conscience. You'd be haunted by the faces of those you'd wronged, their silent accusations echoing in the vast empty halls of your palace. The sweet melodies of your lyre would do little to drown out the internal discord. Sleep, then, wouldn't be a restful escape, but a dangerous frontier where your deepest fears and most heinous acts came back to haunt you. The imperial bed, once a symbol of comfort, became a stage for a never-ending, terrifying play of your own making. From Nero's self-indulgent, often terrifying artistic reign, Rome plunged into a year of unprecedented civil strife known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Imagine, after decades of relatively stable, if sometimes tyrannical rule by the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the very foundations of the empire suddenly crumbling. For you, living through 69 AD, peace and order weren't just elusive, they were entirely mythical. And when an entire empire is in chaos, you can bet that sleep becomes a forgotten luxury, especially for the men desperately clawing for the imperial purple. It's like watching a really intense multi-car pileup in slow motion, knowing you're about to be one of the cars. This was a period of rapid-fire successions, each emperor emerging from a different corner of the empire, propelled to power by their legions, only to be quickly overthrown by another. First, Galba, an elderly general, then Otho, a former companion of Nero, followed by Vitellius, a gluttonous commander from Germany, and finally, Vespasian, the seasoned general who would eventually restore order. You can imagine the psychological toll this constant upheaval took on everyone, but most acutely on the men who wore the imperial toga, however briefly. Consider Galba, the first to seize power after Nero's fall. He was an old man thrust into a whirlwind of political intrigue and military unrest. You, as Galba, would have arrived in Rome exhausted, burdened by the immense task of restoring stability to a bankrupt and rebellious empire. Every senator, every general, every Praetorian guard seemed to have their own agenda. The nights would be spent strategizing, trying to anticipate plots, and worrying about the loyalty of your own troops. There's no soft landing when you take over a country that's just had its mental breakdown. Historians still argue whether Galba's downfall was primarily due to his parsimony and refusal to pay the Praetorian Guard, or his inability to control the rivalries within his own faction. Then came Otho, who orchestrated Galba's assassination. You, as Otho, would have seized the throne in a brutal coup, knowing that you held power by force and that another ambitious general could do the same to you at any moment. His brief reign was dominated by the impending clash with Vitellius, who was marching on Rome with a powerful army. Sleep for Otho would have been almost non-existent, consumed by frantic preparations for war, desperate attempts to rally support, and the chilling knowledge that his life hung by a thread. It's like preparing for the biggest exam of your life, knowing that if you fail, you literally die. Vitellius's brief stint as emperor was marked by gluttony and lavish feasts, a strange juxtaposition with the ongoing civil war. One quirky tidbit is the sheer scale of his banquets, which often involved exotic dishes and enormous expense. While he might have attempted to drown his anxieties in food and drink, this excessive lifestyle would have certainly disrupted any chance of restful sleep. You'd be battling indigestion hangovers and the persistent hum of military dispatches detailing your rival Vespasian's advance. The very act of overindulgence, often a symptom of stress, would further exacerbate your inability to find peace at night. Perhaps a midnight snack was a little too good for him. The sheer instability of this year meant that for any of these short-lived emperors, the primary concern was survival. There was no time for long-term policy, no space for contemplation, only immediate brutal exigency. You wouldn't be worrying about grand legacies or architectural projects. You'd be worried about waking up alive. The sounds of distant marching legions, the rumors of desertion, the chilling knowledge that your reign could end at any moment. Violently would have been the persistent soundtrack to your sleepless nights. The imperial bed, far from being a sanctuary, became a hot seat, constantly vibrating with the tremors of a collapsing world. Emerging from the maelstrom of the year of the four emperors was Vespasian, a no-nonsense general who brought a much-needed dose of practicality and stability back to Rome. You'd think after such a chaotic period, an emperor would finally get some decent sleep. And while Vespasian wasn't plagued by the same kind of psychological demons as some of his predecessors, his brand of sleeplessness stemmed from an equally relentless force: the sheer monumental task of rebuilding Rome. Both physically and financially, it's like being handed the keys to a house that's not just messy, but actively on fire, and you're expected to put it out and redecorate before morning. Vespasian wasn't from the old Roman aristocracy. He was a self-made man, a provincial who had risen through the ranks on military merit. This background gave him a pragmatic, unsentimental approach to governance, which Rome desperately needed. A mainstream historical fact about Vespasian is his initiation of massive public works, most famously the Musser Colosseum. Funded in part by his shrewd financial policies, including new taxes, you as Vespasian would have been acutely aware of the empire's dire financial state after Nero's extravagance in the civil wars. Every night, your mind would be a ledger, balancing expenses against projected revenues, contemplating where to find the coin, to pay your legions, to feed the city, to reconstruct the burned-out districts. The weight of these economic responsibilities would have been immense. It's one thing to command legions. It's another to balance the books of an entire empire. You'd be lying awake, probably with a stylus and wax tablet by your bedside, scribbling calculations, devising new taxes which were not always popular, as you can imagine. The financial health of the empire directly impacted its stability, and Vespasian knew this intimately. The people needed bread and circuses, the legions needed pay, and the state needed money to function. It's like being the CEO of a bankrupt multinational corporation, trying to turn a profit while keeping all your employees from revolting. One quirky tidbit about Vespasian is his famously down-to-earth demeanor and his sense of humor, often at his own expense. He reportedly made a joke on his deathbed about turning into a god. This practical, almost gruff approach suggests a man who didn't let imperial heirs get in the way of getting things done. However, even a man with a good sense of humor can't laugh off the immense pressure of state. His directness also meant he was less prone to the kind of courtly intrigues that tormented earlier emperors, but the fundamental problems of governance remained. Historians still argue whether Vespasian's financial policies, particularly his new taxes, were genuinely necessary for the empire's recovery, or if they disproportionately burdened the common people. Beyond the finances, there was the task of restoring morale and legitimacy to the imperial office. After the debacles of Nero and the year of the four emperors, you'd be constantly aware that public opinion, while not as fickle as a modern poll, mattered. The Romans needed to believe in their emperor again, to trust in his stability and competence. This pressure to perform, to be the steady hand, would also contribute to your sleeplessness. You couldn't afford to show weakness, couldn't afford to seem overwhelmed. You were the rock upon which Rome would be rebuilt. So while Vespasian might not have been haunted by spectral visions or paranoid delusions, his nights would have been filled with the very tangible anxieties of a nation in recovery. He was a builder, a pragmatist, and a problem solver, but even the most efficient mind needs rest. The image isn't of a tormented soul, but of a weary leader, his brow furrowed with calculations and logistics, his sleep snatched in brief, fitful periods between the endless demands of reconstruction. For Vespasian, the empire's troubles weren't a source of mental breakdown, but of relentless grinding work that bled into every hour of the day and night. Following Vespasian's pragmatic reign, his son Domitian took the throne, and with him imperial sleeplessness took on a new chilling dimension, the pervasive dread born from the tyranny and paranoia. You might imagine that with the empire stabilized, Domitian would find more peace than his predecessors, but instead he cultivated an atmosphere of fear that ultimately consumed him. It's like building a meticulously guarded fortress only to realize you're trapped inside it with your own deepening anxieties. Domitian began his rule with promise initiating important administrative and military reforms. But over time, his personality hardened, and he became increasingly autocratic and suspicious. He famously demanded to be addressed as Master and God, Dominus et Deus, a testament to his inflated sense of self and his desire for absolute control. You as Domitian would have viewed any dissent, any independent thought as a personal affront and a potential conspiracy. This mentality created an environment where trust was non-existent and fear was the dominant currency. Your nights would be filled with the chilling certainty that plots were brewing, that betrayal lurked in every shadow. Unlike Tiberius, whose paranoia developed gradually, Domitian seemed to embrace it as a tool of governance. He employed a vast network of informers, delatores, turning Roman society into a web of suspicion where no one could truly trust their neighbor. Imagine lying in your bed knowing that your own courtiers, perhaps even members of your family, were being spied upon, and that a single misinterpreted word could lead to torture and execution. You'd be constantly sifting through reports from these informers, trying to discern truth from fabrication, knowing that your life depended on getting it right. It's like living in a reality TV show where everyone's trying to get you voted off, but the stakes are literally life and death. A mainstream historical fact about Domitian is his intense focus on maintaining strict public morality and prosecuting corruption, which initially gained him some support. However, this desire for order soon morphed into an oppressive reign of terror. He executed numerous prominent citizens, including senators, on charges of treason. You'd be constantly making life and death decisions, and each one, especially those based on flimsy evidence from informers, would add to the immense psychological burden. How do you sleep when you've condemned someone to death based on a whispered accusation? One quirky tidbit about Domitian is his supposed habit of spending hours in solitary confinement, catching flies and piercing them with a sharp stylus. While likely an exaggerated anecdote, it paints a picture of a ruler isolated by his own fear and cruelty, seeking strange outlets for his nervous energy. For you, the emperor, this might have been a perverse form of meditation, a way to focus your restless mind on something tangible, however morbid. Historians still argue whether Domitian's paranoia was a true psychological condition or a calculated political strategy to eliminate opposition and consolidate his power. Regardless of its origin, the result was the same: profound sleeplessness. Your imperial palace, despite its opulence and security, would feel like a suffocating prison. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, every distant dog bark would be amplified by your heightened senses, becoming a potential harbinger of doom. You'd find yourself pacing, staring out into the Roman night, seeing enemies in every shadow. The constant fear of assassination, which ultimately became his fate, would have been a relentless companion, whispering warnings into your ear as you tried in vain to find peace. The imperial bed, far from a place of rest, became a crucible of dread, burning away any hope of tranquil slumber. After the oppressive reign of Domitian, Rome entered a period famously known as the Pax Romana, a time of relative peace and prosperity. The first of the 5 good emperors was Nerva, but his brief reign was less about expansion and more about securing the throne and establishing a stable succession. You can imagine that taking over immediately after a highly paranoid and tyrannical predecessor, especially when you're an older, less militarily inclined senator, would breed its own unique brand of sleeplessness. It's like being the first person to enter a house after a poltergeist has just trashed the place. You're constantly on edge, waiting for something else to jump out at you. Nerva was chosen by the Senate, a deliberate reaction against Domitian's autocracy. His reign was a delicate balancing act. He had to restore senatorial authority and public trust while simultaneously maintaining control over the powerful legions who were still loyal to the memory of Domitian. You as Nerva would have been acutely aware that your position was fragile. The Praetorian Guard, for instance, still harbored resentment over Domitian's death and demanded vengeance against those responsible. This led to a very real and immediate threat to your authority, culminating in the Praetorians besieging the palace and forcing you to hand over those who had been involved in Domitian's assassination. Imagine those nights during the Praetorian uprising. You'd be lying awake listening to the sounds of unrest outside your palace walls, knowing that the very guards meant to protect you were now your greatest threat. The clamor of the legions, the demands for blood, the humiliation of being powerless in your own palace, these events would have burned themselves into your mind, making true rest impossible. This wasn't the paranoia of a tyrant, but the very real fear of an aging emperor, whose authority was being directly challenged by his own military. Historians still argue whether Nerva's adoption of Trajan was a clear act of statesmanship to secure the succession, or a desperate move to appease the powerful military. A mainstream historical fact about Nerva is his significant efforts to restore civil liberties and recall those exiled by Domitian, a deliberate act to heal the wounds of the previous reign. While noble, these actions also meant navigating complex political landscapes, dealing with reinstated officials and their grievances, and trying to reconcile factions. This administrative burden, combined with the underlying military unrest, would certainly have contributed to your restless nights. You'd be working tirelessly during the day, and then your mind would continue the work into the night, strategizing and planning. A quirky tidbit about Nerva is that he was known for his mild temperament and his reputation for integrity. This gentler disposition, while admirable, might have made the cutthroat world of Roman politics even more jarring for him. You, the mild-mannered emperor, would find yourself constantly having to assert authority to make difficult decisions that went against your nature, all while knowing that a single misstep could lead to your downfall. It's like trying to be a kindergarten teacher in a gladiatorial arena. Ultimately, Nerva's greatest legacy was his adoption of Trajan, a popular and capable general, effectively ensuring a smooth and strong succession. But before that moment of clarity, you can bet that the question of who would follow you and whether they would be accepted by the army would have kept you awake for many a long night. The fragile piece of Rome, still reeling from decades of instability, rested squarely on your shoulders, and the weight of that responsibility would have been a constant companion in the quiet hours before dawn. The imperial bed was less a place of repose and more a strategic outpost from which you silently battled the shadows of unrest and uncertainty. With Trajan on the throne, the Roman Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, and with that unparalleled expansion came a unique form of imperial sleeplessness, the immense, exhilarating, yet utterly exhausting burden of global conquest and governance. You'd imagine that a victorious emperor would sleep soundly, lulled by the cheers of his legions. But for Trajan, the vastness of his ambitions and the sheer logistics of commanding such an enormous enterprise would have stolen many a peaceful night. It's like being the CEO of the biggest company in the world, trying to acquire new markets while simultaneously managing operations across dozens of time zones, all without the internet or even reliable postal service. Trajan, unlike his elderly predecessor Nerva, was a seasoned military commander, robust and energetic. His reign is synonymous with Rome's last great period of aggressive expansion, particularly his conquests in Dacia, modern-day Romania, and Parthia. A mainstream historical fact about Trajan is the sheer scale of his military campaigns, which brought vast new territories and immense wealth into the Roman treasury. You as Trajan would be constantly planning, strategizing, and executing these colossal endeavors. This isn't just about winning battles. It's about supplying armies, maintaining supply lines across thousands of miles, pacifying newly conquered regions, and integrating diverse cultures into the Roman system. Imagine lying awake in your tent on the Dacian frontier or in a temporary palace in Mesopotamia. The sounds would be different from those in Rome. Perhaps the distant braying of pack animals, the muted commands of sentries, the soft murmur of foreign tongues. Your mind, however, would be buzzing with military logistics, troop movements, siege engine construction, the deployment of engineers, the welfare of your soldiers. Every decision had life or death consequences, not just for individuals, but for entire legions and the fate of campaigns. It's like playing a real-time strategy game, but with actual human lives at stake and no undo button. One quirky tidbit about Trajan is his personal involvement in the Dacian Wars, famously crossing a massive bridge built across the Danube, a feat of engineering so impressive it's depicted on Trajan's column in Rome. This highlights his hands-on approach, a stark contrast to emperors who preferred to rule from the comfort of Rome. While admirable, this level of personal engagement meant less time for restful sleep. You'd be inspecting fortifications, conferring with engineers, and personally leading troops pushing your physical and mental limits daily. And then at night, the relentless churn of responsibilities would continue in your mind. Historians still argue whether Trajan's aggressive expansionist policies, while initially successful, overextended the empire and sowed the seeds for future defensive struggles. Beyond the military, there was the immense task of governing this sprawling empire. New provinces meant new administrations, new legal challenges, new infrastructure projects. You wouldn't just conquer lands, you'd then have to integrate them, build roads, establish cities, and ensure loyalty. This administrative burden would be just as demanding as the military one, requiring constant decrees, appointments, and oversight. You'd be receiving dispatches from Britannia in the west and Mesopotamia in the east, all demanding your attention, all requiring solutions. So while Trajan may not have been gripped by paranoia or night terrors in the way some other emperors were, his sleeplessness would have been the product of relentless energy and boundless ambition. His mind, even in the quiet of night, would have been a vast map tracing the lines of his empire, planning the next move, anticipating the next challenge. The imperial bed, whether in a palace or a campaign tent, was not a place for idle dreams, but a quiet space where the grand strategies of a world-conquering emperor continued to unfold even as the body yearned for rest. After the vast expansions of Trajan, the new emperor, Hadrian, faced a different kind of imperial burden, one that led to a unique form of sleeplessness, the immense physical and mental exhaustion of constant travel and strategic consolidation. You might think that a more defensive posture would mean less stress, but Hadrian's commitment to personally inspecting every corner of his vast empire meant his nights were often spent in transit or wrestling with the grand logistics of imperial maintenance. It's like being a global CEO who believes in visiting every single branch office, no matter how remote, while simultaneously trying to perfect the company's internal operations. Hadrian, a brilliant and cultured man, inherited an empire that, while at its peak territorial extent, was also overstretched. His pragmatic solution was to consolidate rather than expand, focusing on strengthening existing borders and improving internal administration. A mainstream historical fact about Hadrian is his extensive travels throughout the empire, visiting nearly every province, overseeing defensive fortifications like Hadrian's Wall in Britannia, and personally interacting with local populations. You as Hadrian would have spent more time on the road on ships or in temporary encampments than in the comfortable palaces of Rome. Imagine the sheer physical toll of such constant movement. Days spent riding on horseback, enduring the elements, inspecting legions, listening to petitions from provincial governors, and then at night often sleeping in tents or Spartan accommodations. The sounds would be varied: the creak of a wagon wheel in the distance, the lapping of waves against a ship's hull, the low murmur of your security detail just outside your tent. Your body would ache, but your mind would remain furiously active, processing the vast amounts of information you'd absorbed that day. You'd be mentally mapping out the terrain, assessing the loyalty of legions, planning the next section of a defensive wall, or contemplating the justice of a local dispute. It's like being perpetually jet-lagged, but with the added responsibility of an entire world on your shoulders. One quirky tidbit about Hadrian is his deep passion for Greek culture, to the extent that he was sometimes referred to as the Greekling. He would often travel dressed in Greek attire and participated in Greek philosophical discussions and artistic pursuits. This intellectual curiosity, while enriching, also meant his mind was always engaged, always seeking new knowledge, even during periods of supposed rest. You can picture him late at night, perhaps in a cold, damp fort in Germania, pulling out a scroll of Greek philosophy, trying to find solace or inspiration in ancient wisdom, even as his practical responsibilities weighed heavily. Historians still argue whether Hadrian's consolidation policy was a necessary correction to Trajan's expansionism or a missed opportunity to further extend Roman power. Beyond the physical demands of travel, there was the immense strategic burden. Every wall built, every fort reinforced, every diplomatic negotiation, these were decisions of colossal importance. You'd be constantly evaluating threats from barbarian tribes, assessing the economic viability of distant provinces, and ensuring the smooth functioning of complex legal systems across diverse cultures. The pressure to maintain the integrity of such a vast and varied empire, to prevent its unraveling from within or without, would be a constant hum beneath your consciousness. So for Hadrian, sleep wasn't necessarily stolen by fear of plots or internal turmoil, but by the relentless, globe-trotting dedication to his imperial duty. His nights were a continuation of his days, a ceaseless internal navigation of maps, policies, and populations. The imperial bed, wherever it might temporarily be, became a mobile command center where the sleepless emperor meticulously surveyed and shored up the very foundations of his vast interconnected world. Following Hadrian's extensive travels and consolidation, Antonius Pious brought a period of remarkable tranquility to the Roman Empire. You might understandably assume that an emperor whose reign is often called the most peaceful in Roman history would be the one emperor who slept soundly through the night. But even in times of peace, the weight of the imperial purple is immense, and for Antonius Pious, sleeplessness likely stemmed from the subtle yet pervasive stresses of maintaining stability and managing the sheer complexity of a vast settled empire. It's like being the conductor of a magnificent orchestra that's performing a flawless symphony. You're still constantly aware of every single instrument, every potential discord, and the immense effort it takes to keep everything harmonious. Antonius Pious earned his epithet pious, meaning dutiful, or pious, for his devotion to the state, his clemency, and his respectful relationship with the Senate. A mainstream historical fact about Antonius Pious is that his reign was largely characterized by peace and stability, with very few major military conflicts or internal disturbances. This era is often considered the zenith of the Pax Romana. So if there weren't wars to fight or rebellions to crush, what would keep you as Antonius Pious awake at night? The answer lies in the quiet, unrelenting burden of administration and the responsibility for the welfare of millions. Imagine the sheer volume of petitions, legal cases, and administrative decisions that would cross your desk daily. You'd be responsible for ensuring justice, managing public finances, overseeing infrastructure, and maintaining the delicate balance of power between various factions, all without the dramatic crises that define other reigns. This isn't the adrenaline-fueled sleeplessness of a general on campaign. It's the quiet, persistent weariness of a meticulous administrator. You'd be poring over reports, deliberating on legal precedents, and agonizing over the minutiae of provincial governance. It's like being the head of a massive, well-oiled machine that still requires constant, vigilant oversight to prevent any part from seizing up. One quirky tidbit about Antonius Pious is his deep affection for his wife Faustina the Elder and his grief after her death. He established charities in her name and even named a new type of corn dole after her. This devotion highlights a more personal, emotional side, but even personal grief can contribute to sleeplessness, especially when combined with imperial responsibilities. You can picture him in the quiet hours, perhaps contemplating his personal losses, while simultaneously drafting an edict concerning grain distribution in Egypt. Historians still argue whether the apparent peace of Antonius Pious's reign was a result of his exceptional leadership or simply a fortunate calm before the storms that would engulf the empire after his death. Even in times of peace, the emperor was the ultimate guarantor of Rome's well-being. This meant constant vigilance against corruption, ensuring fair taxation, and mediating disputes that arose within the sprawling empire. You'd be hearing pleas from distant provinces dealing with local unrest that never quite escalated into full-blown rebellion and managing the slow-grinding processes of imperial bureaucracy. The very absence of dramatic crises meant that the subtle pressures of continuous governance were ever present. So for Antonius Pious, sleeplessness wouldn't have been a dramatic struggle against vivid terrors or imminent threats. Instead, it would have been the quiet, persistent hum of responsibility, the relentless mental churn of maintaining an almost perfect peace. His nights, while perhaps not haunted by ghosts of the past or fears of the future, would have been consumed by the meticulous, tireless work of ensuring the present remains stable, prosperous, and just. The imperial bed in his case was less a refuge and more a quiet study, where the benevolent but ceaselessly working mind of the emperor continued to guide his immense and seemingly serene empire. After the peaceful stability of Antoninus Pius, the Roman Empire, and its next emperor, Marcus Aurelius, were thrust into a world of relentless challenges, giving rise to a profound and philosophical form of sleeplessness. Imagine inheriting the largest empire in the world, not at its zenith of calm, but just as it's about to be assaulted from all sides by external threats and internal plagues. For Marcus Aurelius, sleep wasn't just elusive. It was a constant, almost spiritual battle against the weight of a suffering world, even for the most stoic of philosophers. It's like being a deep thinker who suddenly finds themselves simultaneously leading a major war, managing a pandemic, and trying to keep society from unraveling all while maintaining an inner calm. Marcus Aurelius is famously known as the philosopher king, deeply steeped in the principles of Stoicism. His personal reflections recorded in his work, Meditations, offer an unparalleled glimpse into the mind of an emperor grappling with immense pressure. A mainstream historical fact about Marcus Aurelius's reign is the almost constant state of warfare on Rome's frontiers, particularly against Germanic tribes along the Danube, the Marcomannic Wars, and the devastating Antonine Plague, which swept across the empire, killing millions. You, as Marcus Aurelius, would have spent years not in Rome, but on campaign enduring the harsh realities of military life, far from the comforts of the capital. Imagine the nights on the freezing, muddy frontiers of Germania. The sounds would be stark, the howling wind, the crackle of a distant campfire, the low murmur of soldiers, or perhaps the chilling silence of a watchful night. Your body would be weary from long marches and strategic meetings, but your mind would be intensely active, not just planning military maneuvers, but grappling with the immense suffering you witness daily. The plague was a constant, invisible enemy decimating your legions and your populace. You'd be processing casualty reports, making grim logistical decisions about medical supplies and burial details, all while trying to maintain the morale of your troops and the stability of your empire. It's like trying to maintain your profound philosophical composure while simultaneously leading a war and a medical crisis with no end in sight. One quirky tidbit about Marcus Aurelius is his dedication to keeping a personal diary, which became Meditations. These writings are not for publication, but raw, unfiltered thoughts on virtue, duty, and resilience. You can picture him in the dead of night by the flickering light of a lamp in his campaign tent, picking up his stylus and wax tablet, trying to make sense of the chaos around him through philosophical reflection. He writes about sleep, about the difficulty of rising in the morning to face his duties, about the importance of embracing discomfort. This wasn't just a lack of sleep. It was a conscious, philosophical struggle to find meaning and purpose in a world filled with pain. Historians still argue whether Marcus Aurelius's commitment to Stoicism helped him endure the extraordinary pressures of his reign, or if it simply provided a framework for a pre-existing melancholic disposition. The weight of ruling was not just military or administrative. It was deeply existential. You, as Marcus Aurelius, would be confronting death on a massive scale, both from war and pestilence. You'd be struggling to reconcile your stoic ideals of reason and virtue with the brutal, often irrational realities of your reign. Every night as you lay in your tent, you'd be processing not just military intelligence, but the profound questions of life, death, and human suffering. So Marcus Aurelius's sleeplessness was not simply due to external threats, but also to the internal philosophical struggle to remain steadfast and virtuous in the face of relentless adversity. His imperial bed, wherever it was less a place of rest and more a quiet crucible where the burdens of the world were distilled into profound, often sorrowful introspection. He was the emperor who couldn't sleep because his heart and mind were too busy trying to save a world that seemed determined to tear itself apart. After the thoughtful but deeply troubled reign of Marcus Aurelius, the empire descended into a period defined by the excesses and erratic behavior of his son, Commodus. You might expect that a ruler who abandoned the serious duties of empire for gladiatorial combat and personal indulgence would sleep like a baby unburdened by state affairs. But for Commodus, this very decadence and increasingly bizarre lifestyle created a new kind of imperial sleeplessness, the restless agitation of a mind unmoored by responsibility, constantly seeking fleeting pleasures, and ultimately deeply isolated. It's like being a rock star who burns out spectacularly, constantly chasing the next high, but never finding true peace. Commodus famously viewed himself as a reincarnation of Hercules, often appearing in public dressed as the demigod complete with a lion skin and club. A mainstream historical fact about Commodus is his progressive disinterest in the day-to-day administration of the empire, preferring to delegate power to a succession of corrupt favorites while he indulged in lavish gladiatorial games and wild beast hunts in the arena. You as Commodus would increasingly shun the boring realities of governance for the thrill of the fight, the roar of the crowd, and the adulation of your sycophants. Imagine your nights not spent poring over state documents, but perhaps recovering from a day in the arena, your body aching from mock combat or buzzing with the lingering adrenaline of a kill. Or perhaps after a long, decadent banquet filled with too much wine and too many rich foods, your sleep would be fitful and disturbed by indigestion. This isn't the noble sleeplessness of a burdened leader. It's the agitated, often uncomfortable sleep of someone living a profoundly unhealthy lifestyle. You'd be surrounded by luxury, but true rest would remain elusive, banished by physical discomfort and a mind constantly seeking stimulation. It's like trying to sleep after drinking 5 energy drinks and then watching an action movie marathon. One quirky tidbit about Commodus is his obsession with gladiatorial combat, not just as a spectator, but as a participant. He would enter the arena himself, sometimes fighting handicapped opponents or even animals, often to the disgust of the Roman elite. This public spectacle, while initially popular with the masses, became increasingly bizarre and self-serving. For you, the emperor, this was your escape, your passion, your identity. But the pressure to perform, to maintain this persona, would have been immense. Every roar of the crowd, every gasp, would be meticulously noted. And at night, your mind would replay the fights, the victories, the narrow escapes, keeping you agitated rather than allowing you to rest. Historians still argue whether Commodus's bizarre behavior was a result of inherent mental instability, the corrupting influence of absolute power, or simply a reaction against the pressures of being Marcus Aurelius's son. As his rule spiraled, marked by increasing paranoia and violence against those who opposed his excesses, his sleeplessness would have acquired a darker edge. The initial excitement of his debauched lifestyle would give way to the gnawing anxiety of plots and betrayals. The corrupt favorites he empowered often turned against each other and against him. You'd find yourself increasingly isolated, trusting no one, wondering which of your companions would be the next to turn. The same crowds that cheered you in the arena could turn on you in an instant. So for Commodus, sleep was not found in the peaceful fulfillment of duty, but was disrupted by the chaotic pursuit of pleasure and the inevitable paranoia that followed. His imperial bed, designed for opulent comfort, became a stage for restless tossing and turning, haunted by the echoes of the arena, the whispers of betrayal, and the hollow emptiness that comes from a life lived solely for fleeting gratification. He was the emperor who slept badly, not because of the weight of the world, but because he tried so desperately to escape it. After the chaotic spectacle of Commodus, the Roman Empire, already reeling, plunged into a period of intense military rule, ushering in the Severan dynasty. You might assume that a family of hardened soldiers would bring stability and perhaps sounder sleep. But for the Severans, the imperial burden morphed into the constant grinding strain of military campaigns, dynastic squabbles, and the desperate scramble to maintain legions' loyalty. Their nights were less about personal demons and more about the relentless clamor of war and the precariousness of power held by the sword. It's like being the head of a powerful military family business where every relative is vying for control and your main product is constant, expensive warfare. The dynasty began with Septimius Severus, a shrewd and ambitious general from North Africa, who emerged victorious from a brutal civil war that followed Commodus's assassination. A mainstream historical fact about Septimius Severus is his extensive military reforms, particularly increasing the pay and privileges of soldiers, famously advising his sons on his deathbed to enrich the soldiers and scorn all other men. You, as Septimius Severus, would have spent much of your reign on campaign fighting on distant frontiers in Parthia, Britannia, and Africa, battling both external enemies and internal rivals. Imagine your nights in a military camp far from the luxuries of Rome, surrounded by the sounds of the legion, the stamping of horses, the distant calls of sentries, the clatter of arms. Your sleep would be dictated by the demands of war, early starts, late nights, planning strategy, the constant readiness for an attack. Even when resting, your mind would be a battlefield maneuvering legions, calculating supplies, anticipating enemy movements. This wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was the ceaseless mental taxation of a supreme military commander who knew that his power and Rome's stability depended entirely on his legion's success and loyalty. It's like being a chess grandmaster, but every piece is a legion of actual people, and losing means the collapse of an entire empire. The dynastic aspect added another layer of torment. Septimius Severus had two sons, Caracalla and Geta, whose bitter rivalry was a constant source of anxiety. He tried desperately to foster unity, even taking them on campaigns with him, but to no avail. One quirky tidbit is the massive triumphal arch in Rome dedicated to Septimius Severus, depicting his victories, which serves as a grand monument to his military prowess, but perhaps also a silent testament to the exhausting years spent campaigning. For you, the emperor, these grand displays were necessary to project power and legitimacy, but the reality behind the scenes was one of constant vigilance and family strife. Historians still argue whether Septimius Severus's focus on the military and neglect of the Senate laid the groundwork for the later barracks emperors and the crisis of the 3rd century. When his sons Caracalla and Geta inherited the empire, the dynastic tensions exploded. For them, sleep would have been even more precarious. Caracalla, driven by ruthless ambition and a violent temperament, famously murdered his brother Geta in their mother's arms. Imagine the sleepless nights after committing such a heinous act. You, as Caracalla, would be haunted by the specter of your brother, constantly fearing revenge, internal plots, and the judgment of both gods and men. The paranoia would be suffocating, turning every trusted face into a potential assassin. So for the Severans, the imperial bed offered little respite. It was a place where the strategic maps of endless wars were unrolled in the mind, where the whispers of familial betrayal echoed, and where the precarious balance of military power kept even the most hardened soldiers awake. Their sleeplessness was the grim cost of an empire sustained by the sword, a sword that often turned inward, slashing at the very heart of the ruling family. If the Severan dynasty was defined by military strain and dynastic struggles, the reign of Caracalla himself brought imperial sleeplessness to a horrifying peak fueled by fratricide and pervasive fear. Imagine being an emperor whose very ascent to power is stained by the murder of your own brother, a crime committed in the arms of your mother. You might achieve ultimate power, but at what cost to your peace of mind? For Caracalla, sleep was likely a battleground where his own heinous acts and the constant threat of retribution waged an unending war. It's like getting everything you ever wanted only to find it comes with a lifetime supply of terrifying guilt and paranoia. Caracalla, born Lucius Septimius Bassianus, inherited the empire alongside his younger brother Geta, following their father Septimius Severus's death. Their rivalry, which had plagued their father's later years, immediately escalated into open hostility. A mainstream historical fact about Caracalla is his infamous murder of Geta in 201 AD, which then led to a widespread purge of Geta's supporters, said to number in the tens of thousands. You, as Caracalla, would have orchestrated this brutal act forever, binding your reign to an act of unspeakable cruelty. Imagine the nights after such a deed. The blood on your hands, literal or metaphorical, would be impossible to wash away. Every shadow would seem to conceal Geta's ghost, every whisper a plot against you. The paranoia that consumed Tiberius would be amplified 1,000-fold by the knowledge of your own monstrous act. You'd find yourself unable to trust anyone for if you could murder your own flesh and blood, who among your court would not betray you for power. You'd be sleeping with one eye open, the other, darting around the room searching for hidden daggers. It's like living in a permanent horror movie, where you're both the monster and the tormented victim. Caracalla then embarked on extensive military campaigns, particularly against the Germanic tribes, and the Parthians perhaps as a way to distract himself or to gain the loyalty of the legions, whom he heavily favored. One quirky tidbit about Caracalla is the Constitutio Antoniniana of 212 AD, which granted Roman citizenship to virtually all free inhabitants of the empire. While seemingly benevolent, this act was largely seen as a means to expand the tax base. You as Caracalla would have implemented this, perhaps in moments of clarity, or even as a way to create a broader base of loyal citizens. Yet even such a grand gesture couldn't erase the internal demons. Historians still argue whether the Antonine Constitution was primarily a fiscal measure or a genuine attempt at legal reform. His public image was one of a fierce warrior, often appearing with a scowl mimicking Alexander the Great. But beneath this hardened exterior, his mind was likely in constant turmoil. The brutality of his reign, the frequent executions of those he suspected would only feed the cycle of paranoia and sleeplessness. The more fear you instilled, the more enemies you created, and the less you could ever truly rest. You'd be haunted by the eyes of those you condemned, their silent accusations, echoing in your empty, restless hours. So for Caracalla, the imperial bed was not a place of solace, but a constant reminder of his crimes and the precariousness of his life. His nights would be filled with vivid, terrifying dreams, or perhaps no dreams at all, just a blank, exhausting vigilance, waiting for the inevitable retribution that finally came in 217 AD, when he was assassinated by a Praetorian prefect. His sleeplessness was the grim, unrelenting consequence of absolute power wielded without conscience, a constant self-inflicted torment. From the brutal, paranoid world of Caracalla, the Roman Empire lurched into the utterly bizarre and religiously fanatical reign of Elagabalus. Imagine being an emperor whose primary interest isn't governance or military campaigns, but the obsessive promotion of a foreign sun god, accompanied by shocking rituals and a complete disregard for Roman tradition. For Elagabalus, sleeplessness wasn't born of typical imperial anxieties. It sprang from the chaotic demands of cultic craziness and a relentless pursuit of personal, often scandalous gratification. It's like being a cult leader who also happens to run a global empire, and your nights are a whirlwind of strange ceremonies and hedonistic parties, leaving no time for actual rest. Elagabalus, a teenage Syrian priest of the sun god Elagabal, was proclaimed emperor by the legions in 218 AD. His real name was Varius Avitus Bassianus, but he adopted the name of his deity. A mainstream historical fact about Elagabalus is his attempt to replace the traditional Roman pantheon with the worship of his sun god, even building a massive temple, the Elagabalium, on the Palatine Hill, and transferring Rome's most sacred relics there. You as Elagabalus would be utterly consumed by this religious zeal, making it the central focus of your reign, to the utter bewilderment and disgust of the Roman elite. Imagine your nights not spent in quiet contemplation, but likely immersed in elaborate, often nocturnal religious rites. There would be torch-lit processions, animal sacrifices, and perhaps ecstatic dances, all performed in honor of your sun god. These weren't quiet, reverent ceremonies. They were intense, all-consuming affairs. Your days would blur into nights as the demands of your cultic practices dictated your schedule. Sleep would be snatched in short, disjointed bursts, if at all, constantly interrupted by the next ritual or the next scandalous entertainment. It's like being a party planner for a deity, where the party never truly ends and you're always on duty. One quirky tidbit about Elagabalus is his infamous penchant for cross-dressing and his alleged attempts to find a surgeon to perform gender reassignment surgery. While ancient sources are often biased and exaggerated, these accounts, combined with his multiple marriages to both men and women, including a Vestal virgin, painted a picture of an emperor who defied all Roman societal norms. For you, the emperor, these personal expressions were perhaps liberating, but they would also have fueled constant gossip, outrage, and open defiance from the conservative Roman establishment. This public scandal and political backlash would certainly contribute to restless nights as you grappled with mounting opposition from both the Senate and the military. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus's eccentric behavior was a sign of genuine psychological instability or a deliberate, if ultimately self-destructive attempt to challenge Roman traditions. Beyond the religious zeal and personal eccentricities, there was the inherent instability of his rule. Your advisors and family, particularly your grandmother, Julia Mesa, who had engineered your rise to power, would constantly be trying to rein you in to guide you towards more traditional governance. You'd be battling not just external threats, but the internal struggle for control of your own court. This constant tug of war, combined with your own unconventional lifestyle, would leave little room for peace. So for Elagabalus, sleep was a luxury sacrificed on the altar of religious obsession and unrestrained indulgence. His imperial bed was not a place of quiet reflection, but a temporary pause between frenzied rituals and scandalous escapades. His sleeplessness was the byproduct of a reign that completely upended traditional Roman expectations, leading to a chaotic, short-lived rule that ultimately ended in his violent overthrow and assassination. After the chaotic and scandalous reign of Elagabalus, the Roman Empire briefly found a more traditional, if ultimately tragic emperor in his cousin in Alexander Severus. You might hope that a young, seemingly well-intentioned ruler would bring a measure of peace, but for Alexander Severus, sleeplessness stemmed from a different, yet equally potent source: the suffocating influence of his maternal meddling and the increasing instability of the empire's frontiers. It's like being a teenager trying to run a multinational corporation while your extremely overbearing mother is constantly micromanaging every single decision. Alexander Severus was a mild-mannered, educated youth raised primarily by his powerful and influential grandmother, Julia Mesa, and his mother, Julia Mamaea. It was Julia Mesa who engineered his rise, calculating that a more traditional, less scandalous emperor was needed after Elagabalus's debacle. A mainstream historical fact about Alexander Severus is that he was largely seen as a puppet emperor, with real power residing first with his grandmother and then almost entirely with his mother, Julia Mamaea. You as Alexander would have been constantly overshadowed, your decisions often overridden or dictated by your formidable mother. Imagine your nights not just wrestling with the immense responsibilities of empire, but with the profound frustration of not being truly in charge. Every edict, every appointment, every military strategy would likely be subject to your mother's approval, her whispered advice, or her outright command. You'd be lying awake, perhaps chafing under her control, or perhaps genuinely confused about the best course of action without her guidance. This constant maternal oversight, while possibly well-intentioned, robbed you of true autonomy and consequently true peace of mind. It's like being in a constant state of second-guessing yourself, because someone else always has the final say, even when you're supposed to be the supreme ruler. One quirky tidbit about Alexander Severus is his supposed personal veneration of figures like Abraham Orpheus, Apollonius of Tyana, and even Jesus Christ alongside traditional Roman deities, reflecting a syncretic, intellectually open approach to religion. This open-mindedness, while commendable, also highlights a personality perhaps more suited to scholarly pursuits than the brutal realities of imperial power. For you, the emperor, this personal piety might have offered some solace, but it did little to alleviate the political pressures or the stress of your mother's constant involvement. Historians still argue whether Julia Mamaea's influence on Alexander Severus was genuinely beneficial for the empire, or if it ultimately undermined his authority and led to his downfall. Adding to this domestic tension were the growing external threats. The Roman frontiers, particularly in the east against the rising Sasanian Persian Empire, and in the north against increasingly aggressive Germanic tribes, demanded constant attention. You as Alexander would have been forced to lead campaigns, despite perhaps not possessing the same military acumen as many of your predecessors. The pressure of these wars, combined with your mother's presence on campaign, Julia Mamaea, reportedly even accompanied him into battle, would create an almost unbearable strain. So for Alexander, Severus' sleeplessness wasn't just about the external dangers to the empire. It was deeply personal, rooted in his inability to truly exercise his own authority. His imperial bed was a place where the strategic demands of war mingled with the frustrating echoes of his mother's omnipresent influence. He was an emperor caught between the crushing weight of imperial responsibility and the smothering embrace of a dominating maternal figure, a combination that ultimately left him sleepless, undermined, and tragically vulnerable to the very legions he commanded, who eventually assassinated him and his mother in a military mutiny. After the reign of Alexander Severus, the Roman Empire plunged headlong into one of its most tumultuous periods, famously known as the main crisis of the 3rd century. You cannot overstate the chaos, approximately 26 emperors or claimants in just 50 years, most meeting violent ends alongside rampant civil wars, economic collapse, barbarian invasions, and devastating plagues. For any Roman emperor during this time, sleep wasn't just elusive, it was an impossible dream, a cruel joke played by a relentlessly hostile universe. It's like being trapped in a never-ending high-stakes game of musical chairs, but every time the music stops, someone gets decapitated, and you're always one of the players. This era from 235 to 284 AD saw the imperial throne become less a seat of power and more a death trap. Emperors rose and fell with terrifying rapidity, often proclaimed by their legions, and then quickly murdered by those same legions or by rival claimants. A mainstream historical fact about the crisis of the 3rd century is the almost complete breakdown of central authority, leading to the rise of splinter empires like the Gallic Empire and the Palmyrene Empire, and widespread economic devastation due to constant warfare and debasement of coinage. You, as one of these barracks emperors, would find yourself in a perpetual state of emergency with no time for rest, let alone peaceful slumber. Imagine your nights as one of these emperors. You might be in a temporary camp on a muddy frontier, a besieged city, or a hastily secured palace. The sounds would be of constant tension, the distant cries of battle, the marching of troops, the anxious whispers of your advisors, perhaps even the gnawing silence of an empty treasury. Your mind would be a whirlwind of tactical decisions, political maneuvering, and desperate pleas for loyalty. You'd be plotting your next military move, worrying about a potential mutiny among your own troops, and dreading the news of a new barbarian incursion or a rival general proclaiming himself emperor. It's like trying to juggle chainsaws while riding a unicycle on a tightrope over a pit of angry lions. One quirky tidbit from this period is the sheer variety of men who briefly held the purple. Many were seasoned soldiers rising from humble origins who knew how to fight, but perhaps not how to govern a vast collapsing empire. For you, the emperor, your rise would have been through brutal force, and your survival would depend on maintaining that force. The constant vigilance required to prevent assassination from your own men or defeat from an external foe would be exhausting beyond measure. Historians still argue whether the crisis of the 3rd century was primarily a military crisis, an economic one, or a deeper systemic failure of the Roman political structure. The economic reality alone was enough to keep anyone awake. Hyperinflation meant your legions were demanding more pay, but your coins were worth less. Supplying your armies was a nightmare. Cities were depopulated by plague and constant raiding. You'd be receiving reports of famine in one province, barbarian incursions in another, and a new usurper in a third. There was no grand strategy, just desperate damage control, day after relentless day and night after night. So for the emperors of the crisis of the 3rd century, sleep was not just elusive, it was practically non-existent. Their imperial beds, wherever they managed to lay their heads, were temporary bivouacs in a war-torn world offering no sanctuary from the relentless pressures of a dying empire. Their sleeplessness was the physical and mental manifestation of an era of unprecedented, unremitting stress, a chilling testament to the utter futility of trying to find peace in a world that had gone utterly mad. After the near-total collapse of the Roman Empire during the crisis of the 3rd century, a monumental figure emerged to pull it back from the brink: Diocletian. You might imagine that such a formidable reorganizer would be able to impose order on his own sleep, but for Diocletian, his immense sleepless burden stemmed from the sheer relentless effort of imperial reorganization and the creation of a vast, complex bureaucracy. It's like being the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation that's just gone through 50 hostile takeovers, and your job is to completely rebuild its structure from the ground up by hand without a single instruction manual. Diocletian was a shrewd military commander who understood that the old centralized system of government was no longer sustainable for such a vast and beleaguered empire. A mainstream historical fact about Diocletian is his establishment of the tetrarchy, a system of 4 co-emperors, 2 Augusti and 2 Caesars, to more effectively govern and defend the sprawling Roman territories. This wasn't just a political reshuffle. It was a fundamental reimagining of Roman governance and administrative revolution designed to prevent the kind of rapid successions that had plagued the previous century. You as Diocletian would have been the senior Augustus, the architect of this grand design, bearing the ultimate responsibility for its success or failure. Imagine your knights in the newly established imperial capitals far from Rome, such as Nicomedia or Trier. The sounds would be of a different kind of industry, not just military drills, but the constant hum of administrative activity messengers, arriving at all hours, the rustle of countless scrolls being compiled. Your mind would be a colossal blueprint, designing new administrative divisions, implementing tax reforms, overseeing massive construction projects, and coordinating military defenses across multiple frontiers. This wasn't just about making decisions. It was about inventing an entirely new system of governance, ensuring the 4 emperors worked mostly in harmony and preventing civil war from breaking out again. It's like trying to build a new, incredibly complex operating system for a computer while it's still running and constantly under attack. One quirky tidbit about Diocletian is that after his unprecedented 20-year reign and successful implementation of the Tetrarchy, he famously abdicated his power in 305 AD, choosing to retire to his palace in Split, modern-day Croatia, and tend to his cabbage garden. This act was virtually unheard of for a Roman emperor, most of whom held power until death, often violent. While this retirement speaks to a man who eventually desired peace, it also highlights the extraordinary stress of his reign. You can picture him in the years leading up to his abdication, constantly pushing himself, knowing that only through his relentless efforts could the empire be saved. Historians still argue whether Diocletian's abdication was a testament to his statesmanship or a recognition of the inherent limitations of the Tetrarchy. Beyond the administrative reforms, Diocletian also initiated the Great Persecution of Christians, the largest and most systematic persecution in Roman history. This policy, driven by a desire for religious uniformity and traditional Roman values, would have added another layer of intense pressure and public unrest. You'd be dealing with widespread defiance martyrs being created and the constant logistical challenges of enforcing such a sweeping policy across the empire. So for Diocletian, sleep was not so much stolen by fear of personal assassination, though that was always a possibility, but by the sheer unyielding demands of his colossal task. His imperial bed, wherever it was, served less as a place of rest and more as a command center for the tireless architect of a reborn empire. His sleeplessness was the very price of saving Rome, a quiet testament to the intellectual and administrative rigor required to pull a civilization back from the precipice of oblivion. Following Diocletian's revolutionary but ultimately unsustainable tetrarchy, the Roman Empire saw the rise of Constantine the Great, an emperor whose sleeplessness would be driven by a potent mix of ambition, civil war, and the profound spiritual upheaval of his Christian conversion. Imagine taking control of an empire still reeling from decades of crisis, only to find yourself embroiled in a series of brutal internal conflicts, all while undergoing a transformative religious experience. For Constantine, the imperial bed was less a place of rest and more a strategic outpost where battles for both temporal and spiritual supremacy were fought in the mind. It's like being a CEO fighting a hostile takeover while simultaneously undergoing a dramatic personal spiritual awakening, and both processes demand all your waking and sleeping thoughts. Constantine's path to sole rule was paved with the bodies of his rivals Maxentius, Licinius, and others. A mainstream historical fact about Constantine is his pivotal victory at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, where he famously attributed his success to the Christian God, leading to his eventual conversion in the Edict of Milan. 313 AD, which granted religious tolerance throughout the empire. You as Constantine would have been a seasoned general used to the demands of campaign, but these civil wars were different. These were battles for the very soul of the empire fought against former colleagues and family members. Imagine the nights before a major battle, particularly the Milvian Bridge. The tension would be unbearable. Your mind would be a whirlwind of tactical plans, troop deployments, and supply lines. But for Constantine, there was an added unprecedented layer, the spiritual dimension. The traditional Roman gods seemed to have failed the empire during the crisis of the 3rd century. Now faced with overwhelming odds, you've reportedly had a divine vision, a sign from the Christian God. This adds an almost unbearable pressure. You're not just fighting for power, you're fighting for a divine mandate for the very truth of a new faith. It's like placing all your bets on a revolutionary new technology, and if it fails, not only do you lose everything, but your entire belief system is invalidated. One quirky tidbit about Constantine is his foundation of a new capital city, Constantinople, built on the site of Byzantium. This monumental undertaking, which rivaled Rome itself in grandeur, was partly motivated by strategic considerations and partly by a desire to create a new Christian capital untainted by pagan traditions. You, as Constantine, would have poured immense energy into this project, overseeing its design, construction, and rapid growth. Even after securing military victories, the logistics and politics of building an entirely new imperial city on such a grand scale would have provided endless sources of sleepless nights. Historians still argue whether Constantine's conversion was a genuine spiritual awakening or a shrewd political move to harness the growing power of Christianity. Beyond the civil wars in the new capital, there was the complex task of integrating Christianity into the fabric of the empire. This wasn't a simple switch. It involved navigating deep-seated pagan traditions, managing diverse Christian factions, often with fervent disagreements as seen at the Council of Nicaea, and using the new faith to unify a fractured populace. You'd be constantly mediating disputes, issuing edicts that blended secular and religious law, and essentially inventing the role of a Christian emperor. So for Constantine, sleeplessness wasn't just a byproduct of ambition and warfare. It was deeply intertwined with his spiritual journey and the immense challenge of ushering in a new era for Rome. His imperial bed was a place where military strategy converged with theological debate, where the past clashed with the future, and where the burdens of both earthly power and divine favor kept him in a state of perpetual, transformative wakefulness. After Constantine's revolutionary reign, the Roman Empire, now officially embracing Christianity, saw a brief but potent backlash in the form of the Julian the Apostate. Imagine an emperor who, raised Christian, consciously rejects the faith of his predecessor and attempts to revive paganism, all while battling a resurgent Persian empire. For Julian, sleeplessness was not merely a physical state, it was the intense intellectual and existential torment of a man battling the prevailing tide of history, driven by a fervent, almost desperate philosophical mission. It's like being a CEO trying to completely reverse a company's hugely successful pivot, convinced that the old forgotten ways are superior and fighting everyone tooth and nail to prove it. Julian was a nephew of Constantine who narrowly survived the purges that followed his uncle's death. Raised under close supervision, he received a rigorous education, secretly cultivating a deep admiration for Greek philosophy and traditional paganism. A mainstream historical fact about Julian is his attempt during his brief reign to restore paganism, as the state religion actively promoting polytheistic worship and restricting the influence of Christians in public life. You, as Julian, would be driven by a passionate belief that Rome's former glory was intrinsically linked to its ancient gods, and that the adoption of Christianity had weakened the empire. Imagine your nights not just planning military campaigns against the formidable Sasanian Persians, but also meticulously strategizing the revival of ancient cults. You'd be poring over classical texts, designing temple renovations, and composing theological treatises, defending paganism, all while simultaneously trying to manage the immense logistical demands of a major war. This wasn't a simple administrative task. It was a crusade of intellectual conviction against deeply entrenched societal changes. You'd be facing subtle and sometimes overt resistance from vast segments of your population who had embraced the new faith. It's like trying to rewrite a country's entire cultural identity single-handedly while also fending off an invasion. One quirky tidbit about Julian is his ascetic lifestyle, often eschewing imperial luxury, preferring to eat simple food and neglecting his appearance much to the chagrin of his courtiers. He even published a satirical work, Misopogon, or Beard Hater, mocking the sophisticated people of Antioch who disliked his unkempt beard. This devotion to philosophical austerity, while admirable, also suggests a mind constantly engaged in self-discipline and intellectual pursuits, leaving little room for carefree rest. You can picture him, late at night perhaps, after a long day of reviewing military plans, turning to a scroll of Plato or Neoplatonic philosophy, seeking guidance or solace in the wisdom of the ancients, even as the Christian world he rejected continued its inexorable growth. Historians still argue whether Julian's attempted pagan revival was a genuine religious movement or a politically motivated effort to consolidate traditional Roman identity. The psychological toll of fighting against the prevailing tide would have been immense. You'd be constantly aware of the deep-seated opposition, the whispers of apostate following you. Every setback, military or political, would be interpreted by your enemies as a sign of divine displeasure from the Christian God. This intense pressure, coupled with the real and present danger of the Persian War, would create a profound state of internal conflict, making restful sleep incredibly difficult. So for Julian, sleeplessness was not born of mere ambition or even conventional fear, but from the relentless dedication to a grand, almost quixotic, philosophical and religious mission. His imperial bed, often a simple camp cot on campaign, was a place where the intellectual battles for Rome's soul were waged, where the weight of historical destiny pressed down, and where the unyielding convictions of a solitary emperor kept him in a state of tireless, tragic wakefulness until his untimely death in battle against the Persians. After Julian's brief religiously charged reign, the Roman Empire, increasingly divided and vulnerable, saw emperors whose sleeplessness was dominated by the relentless, grinding anxiety of your frontier defense against ever-increasing barbarian threats. One such emperor was Valentinian, a formidable soldier whose reign was a ceaseless struggle to shore up the collapsing borders of the Western Roman Empire. Imagine being the chief security officer of a massive crumbling fortress with cracks appearing everywhere and hostile forces constantly probing for weaknesses. For Valentinian, sleep was a luxury he rarely afforded himself, consumed by the brutal realities of a crumbling frontier. It's like being in a permanent state of emergency where every phone call in the middle of the night could be news of another breach. Valentinian was a strong, disciplined military man chosen by the army after the sudden death of Jovian, Julian's successor. He quickly recognized the immense scale of the threats facing the empire and made a pivotal decision to divide the imperial administration, ruling the West himself while entrusting the East to his brother Valens. A mainstream historical fact about Valentinian is his tireless dedication to strengthening the western frontiers, particularly along the Rhine and Danube rivers, constructing numerous forts and defensive works against Germanic tribes like the Alemanni and the Saxons. You as Valentinian would be constantly on the move, personally overseeing these defenses, far from the grand palaces of Rome or even Milan. Imagine your nights not in a soft bed, but often in a military camp or a Spartan fort surrounded by the chill of a northern winter. The sounds would be of the frontier, the crackle of watchfires, the distant howls of wolves, the muffled commands of sentries, and the constant awareness of the unseen enemy lurking just beyond the palisades. Your body would be exhausted from days spent inspecting fortifications, drilling troops, and assessing strategic vulnerabilities. But your mind would remain furiously active, mapping out defensive lines, anticipating barbarian movements, and agonizing over troop deployments. Every report of a skirmish, every rumor of a larger raiding party would snap you back to full alert. It's like being a permanent air traffic controller during a massive storm, constantly directing planes, and knowing one wrong move could lead to catastrophe. One quirky tidbit about Valentinian is his deep interest in military engineering and his personal involvement in the design and construction of new fortifications. He was reportedly a hands-on leader, meticulously inspecting the work. This dedication, while effective, meant that even in moments of supposed rest, your mind would be consumed by the technical details of defense. You'd be thinking about the optimal height of a wall, the best placement for a watchtower, the logistics of transporting building materials. Historians still argue whether Valentinian's decision to split the empire into two administrative halves was a pragmatic necessity or an acceleration of the ultimate division of East and West. Beyond the physical fortifications, there was the immense psychological burden of constant warfare. The barbarians weren't just external threats. They were a persistent existential dread. You'd be dealing with the aftermath of raids, the pleas of displaced civilians, and the heavy casualties among your legions. The economic strain of maintaining such a large military on active duty and the political maneuvering required to keep provinces loyal despite the constant danger would add to the sleepless nights. So for Valentinian, sleep was not about personal ambition or internal plots, but about the overwhelming, unceasing pressure of protecting a collapsing world. His imperial bed, often a rough cot on the frontier, offered no sanctuary from the echoes of barbarian drums and the chilling whispers of an empire under siege. His sleeplessness was the grim testament to his tireless, often desperate efforts to hold back the tide of encroaching darkness in the West. As the Roman Empire continued its slow, agonizing decline in the West, the reign of thus Theodosius II saw a new source of imperial sleeplessness emerge: the profound anxieties arising from enforcing religious unity and grappling with the fracturing identity of a Christian empire. Imagine being an emperor who not only has to deal with persistent barbarian threats, but also feels compelled to declare a single version of Christianity as the official state religion, thereby creating new internal divisions. For Theodosius, sleep was likely disturbed by the intense theological debates and the immense socio-political consequences of trying to impose a singular faith on a vast, diverse, and increasingly divided populace. It's like being the head of state trying to enforce a very specific dress code on every citizen, knowing that half of them deeply resent it all while your borders are being attacked. Theodosius, a Spanish general, was appointed Augustus of the East by Gratian Valentinian Rist's son after a devastating Roman defeat by the Goths at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD. A mainstream historical fact about Theodosius I is his pivotal role in making Nicene Christianity, Trinitarian Christianity, the official state religion of the Roman Empire through the Edicts of Thessalonica in 380 AD. This wasn't just a religious preference, it was a legislative act that outlawed traditional pagan practices and various Christian heresies. You as Theodosius would have been deeply devout, convinced that religious unity was essential for the empire's survival and divine favor. Imagine your nights not just filled with reports of Gothic movements or internal rebellions, but with the fervent, often acrimonious arguments of theologians and bishops. You'd be presiding over councils issuing decrees that defined orthodox belief and suppressing dissenting Christian sects like Arianism. This was a battle for the very soul of the empire, fought with words, edicts, and sometimes force. The pressure to get it right to ensure divine favor for Rome would be immense. You'd be worrying about the spiritual health of your empire as much as its physical borders, and the resistance to your policies would be a constant nagging source of anxiety. It's like being a referee in a highly passionate, very high-stakes theological debate where every call you make alienates half the audience. One quirky tidbit about Theodosius is his infamous massacre of Thessalonica in 390 AD, where thousands of citizens were killed in retaliation for a riot, an act for which he was publicly rebuked by Bishop Ambrose of Milan and forced to do penance. This event highlights the tension between imperial authority and the growing power of the church. For you, the emperor, this public humiliation and the moral weight of such a brutal act would certainly have led to sleepless nights as you grappled with the consequences of your absolute power and the spiritual demands placed upon you by a powerful bishop. Historians still argue whether Theodosius's aggressive religious policies were a sincere expression of faith or a political tool to unify a fractured empire under a single ideology. Beyond the religious anxieties, Theodosius also faced significant military challenges, notably the ongoing Gothic problem. After Adrianople, he famously settled large numbers of Goths within the empire, often as foederati allies, which was a pragmatic but controversial policy. You'd be balancing military necessity with the economic and social implications of integrating large groups of potentially hostile foreigners within your borders. This complex, often unpopular strategy would add another layer of pressure to your already burdened mind. So for Theodosius, sleeplessness was a complex weave of theological conviction, political necessity, and the raw consequences of his actions. His imperial bed, though often in the east, was a place where the fate of souls and the stability of the empire were equally weighty concerns, keeping him in a perpetual state of vigilance as he tried to reshape Rome into a unified Christian state. After the well-meaning but ultimately unsustainable attempts at unity by Theodosius, the Western Roman Empire entered its final grim act under emperors like Honorius. You might imagine that with the empire so clearly unraveling, any emperor would be perpetually awake, racked with despair. For Honorius, however, his particular brand of sleeplessness often stemmed from a tragic mix of incompetence, indecision, and the sheer overwhelming dread of watching a civilization collapse around you, often from a distance. It's like being the captain of a sinking ship, but instead of trying to plug the holes, you're mostly just rearranging the deck chairs and wondering if anyone else notices the water rising. Honorius became Western Roman emperor as a young boy, barely 10 years old upon the death of his father, Theodosius I. His long reign, 395–423 AD, was characterized by a succession of weak and indecisive leadership, with real power often residing with strong generals or court officials. A mainstream historical fact about Honorius's reign is the catastrophic sack of Rome by the Visigoths under Alaric in 410 an event that sent shockwaves across the Roman world, as the Eternal City had not been sacked by a foreign enemy for nearly 800 years. You, as Honorius, famously spent much of your reign in Ravenna, a fortified city on the Adriatic coast, rather than in Rome, creating a physical and psychological distance from the empire's escalating woes. Imagine your nights in Ravenna behind its formidable walls, hearing the constant terrifying reports. News of legions abandoning their posts, provinces breaking away, and barbarian hordes ravaging the heartland of Italy. Yet you, as Honorius, often seem strangely detached, almost passive. This wasn't the active, strategic sleeplessness of a warrior emperor. It was the passive, agonizing wakefulness of someone unable to act, paralyzed by the enormity of the crisis. You'd be receiving frantic pleas for help from Rome, from Gaul, from Hispania, and your advisors would be squabbling over strategy while you perhaps focused on pigeon breeding, a quirky tidbit about Honorius, highlighting his perceived disinterest in governance. It's like being bombarded with urgent emails about a company-wide meltdown, but your response is to reorganize your sock drawer. The sack of Rome itself would have been a profound source of torment. Even from Ravenna, the psychological impact of that event would have been immense. The very idea that Rome, the heart of the empire, could fall to barbarians was unthinkable. You'd be grappling with public outrage, the loss of prestige, and the chilling realization that no place was truly safe. Historians still argue whether Honorius's inaction during the Visigothic campaigns was due to strategic prudence or crippling incompetence. Beyond the major catastrophic events, there was the constant low-level hum of administrative collapse. The tax base was shrinking, armies were unpaid, and internal factions were tearing the empire apart. You'd be struggling with the logistics of feeding a dwindling populace, defending an increasingly indefensible border, and trying to maintain some semblance of imperial authority over provinces that were effectively autonomous. Every diplomatic failure, every lost battle, every act of betrayal would compound the despair, making restful sleep a remote possibility. So for Honorius, sleeplessness was less about active leadership and more about the crushing burden of a responsibility he was ill-equipped to handle, combined with the profound psychological toll of watching his world crumble. His imperial bed in Ravenna became a quiet, lonely witness to the agonizing, prolonged death of an empire, where the emperor himself was largely a spectator, haunted by the whispers of an encroaching darkness he seemed powerless to stop. After Honorius's detached reign, the Western Roman Empire didn't simply fall, it faded piece by agonizing piece under a succession of short-lived and increasingly powerless figures. For these last emperors of the West, sleeplessness was the chilling existential dread of presiding over the final demise of an empire that had defined the world for centuries. You were no longer trying to solve problems. You were merely witnessing the inevitable, a puppet ruler whose every night was haunted by the whisper of its own impending irrelevance. It's like being the last remaining employee in a company that's gone bankrupt, watching the lights turn off one by one. From Honorius's death in 423 AD until Romulus Augustulus' deposition in 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire saw a rapid turnover of emperors, many installed and removed by powerful barbarian generals, especially Ricimer, who acted as the true power behind the throne. A mainstream historical fact about this period is that these emperors often had little real authority outside of Italy, and sometimes not even much within it, as barbarian kingdoms effectively carved out their own territories within the former Roman lands. You, as one of these emperors, perhaps Avitus Majorian, or even the tragically named Romulus Augustulus, would find yourself in an increasingly untenable position. Imagine your knights in the dying empire. You wouldn't be in Rome, but likely in Ravenna or some other fleeting capital, a ghost of imperial grandeur. The sounds would be of a shrinking world, the muted whispers of your few remaining advisors, the distant sound of barbarian raiders, or perhaps just the oppressive silence of a palace that felt too large for the dwindling power it represented. Your mind wouldn't be plotting grand campaigns or major reforms. It would be agonizing over desperate diplomacy, trying to secure alliances with barbarian warlords, and begging the Eastern Empire for assistance that rarely came. The awareness that your actual power extended little beyond the palace walls would be a constant humiliating weight. It's like being given the title of king of the world, but your actual kingdom is just your backyard, and even that's being slowly encroached upon by aggressive neighbors. One quirky tidbit about this period is the very young age of some of these last emperors, such as Romulus Augustulus, who was little more than a boy when he was deposed. This highlights the desperate search for any legitimate claimant, however weak, to simply fill the imperial void. For you as such a young emperor, your sleeplessness wouldn't be from strategic burdens, but from the terrifying realization of your own powerlessness, trapped in a role you didn't choose, witnessing a cataclysm you couldn't comprehend, let alone stop. Historians still argue whether the fall of the Western Roman Empire was a single event or a gradual process of transformation and decentralization. The psychological toll of this lingering dread would be immense. You'd be hearing constant reports of provinces, lost cities sacked, and the very Roman way of life disappearing. The once unthinkable was now commonplace. You'd be looking at maps that showed less and less of the empire actually under your control. The feeling of utter helplessness, of being swept away by forces far beyond your command, would be suffocating. There was no glory in this twilight, only the creeping, pervasive fear of the final night. So, for these last emperors, sleep was less about active leadership and more about the crushing, passive weight of inevitable decline. Their imperial beds were not command centers, but fragile perches from which they watched helpless and sleepless as the mighty Roman Empire in the West breathed its last ragged breaths. Their sleeplessness was the grim, quiet soundtrack to the end of an era. While the Western Roman Empire gasped its last, the Eastern Roman Empire, soon to be known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to flourish for another 1,000 years, but not without its own unique forms of imperial sleeplessness. You might think that surviving the collapse of the West would mean calmer nights, but the emperors in Constantinople faced a new array of challenges. The constant threat from powerful empires, Persians then Arabs, religious schisms, and the intricate, often deadly world of Byzantine court intrigue. It's like being the CEO of a company that inherited all the problems of its failed sister company, and now you have to navigate a labyrinth of new competitors and internal betrayals, all while trying to keep up appearances. The Byzantine Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, New Rome, maintained a stronger economy, more centralized administration, and a formidable military, allowing it to withstand the pressures that crushed the West. However, this didn't mean an easy life for its emperors. A mainstream historical fact about the Byzantine Empire is its persistent struggles on multiple fronts, particularly against the Sasanian Persian Empire in the east, and later the rising power of the Arab caliphates. You, as a Byzantine emperor, would be constantly strategizing against formidable, often existential, external threats. Imagine your knights in the great palace of Constantinople, a marvel of architecture and luxury, but one whose grandeur couldn't shield you from the realities of war. The sounds would be different from the crumbling West. Perhaps the rhythmic calls of the city watched the distant clang of the Imperial Guard or the whisper of the Bosporus. Your mind would be a sophisticated geopolitical map, tracing troop movements in Syria, naval strategies in the Mediterranean, and diplomatic negotiations with distant lands. The pressure to maintain the empire's vast territories and to project an image of impregnability would be immense. You'd be reviewing intelligence reports, deliberating on the loyalty of provincial governors, and agonizing over the logistics of supplying distant armies. It's like being the supreme commander of a powerful but perpetually embattled military, where the enemy is always at your gates and retreat is not an option. One quirky tidbit about Byzantine court life is the elaborate ceremonial etiquette designed to emphasize the emperor's divine authority and create a sense of awe. This included complex rituals, highly stylized clothing, and even mechanical toys like golden lions that roared or birds that sang in the imperial throne room. While these might seem frivolous, they were crucial tools of power projection. For you, the emperor, maintaining this elaborate facade, performing your role with flawless precision, would be another source of stress, knowing that any misstep could be seen as a sign of weakness. Historians still argue whether the Byzantine emphasis on elaborate court ritual was a sign of increasing rigidity or a shrewd method of maintaining imperial mystique and control. Beyond external wars, the Byzantine Empire was often racked by fierce theological disputes and constant court intrigues. Debates over Christology or iconoclasm could lead to widespread riots and even civil war. And within the palace walls, powerful eunuchs, ambitious family members, and scheming factions constantly vied for influence, posing a perpetual threat to your life and throne. You'd be sleeping with one eye open, not just for external enemies, but for the poison in your cup or the assassin in the shadows, a danger far more subtle and insidious than barbarian raids. So for Byzantine emperors, sleeplessness was a complex web of relentless external pressures, deep internal religious divisions, and the chilling reality of courtly betrayal. Their imperial beds, despite their opulence, were never truly sanctuaries, but rather command posts and silent witnesses to the ceaseless battles, both military and political, that kept the Eastern Roman Empire alive, albeit at a constant price of its rulers' peace of mind. Among the most sleepless of Byzantine emperors was Justinian, a monumental figure whose reign was defined by almost superhuman ambition and the relentless labor of legal reform, military reconquest, and grand architectural projects. You might think that success would bring serenity, but for Justinian, every triumph seemed to breed a new challenge, keeping him in a constant state of driven, often anxious wakefulness. It's like being a CEO who decides to completely rewrite all the laws of your country, launch major wars on three fronts simultaneously, and build the most ambitious construction project in 1,000 years, all while personally overseeing every detail. Justinian's goal was nothing less than the restoration of the Roman Empire to its former glory, particularly in the West. A mainstream historical fact about Justinian is his ambitious military campaigns to reconquer former Western Roman territories, led by brilliant generals like Belisarius and Narses, reclaiming parts of North Africa from the Vandals, Italy, from the Ostrogoths and parts of Spain. You as Justinian would be constantly directing these vast and expensive wars, which spanned decades and consumed immense resources. Imagine your nights in the Great Palace surrounded by stacks of dispatches and military maps. The sounds would be of a bustling imperial court that never truly slept, scribes, working messengers, arriving from distant battlefields, advisors whispering. Your mind would be a maelstrom of strategic decisions, troop movements, naval logistics, funding for endless wars, and the political aftermath of each victory and setback. The victories were often hard-won and fragile, constantly threatened by counterattacks or internal rebellions. You'd be processing a staggering amount of information, trying to foresee every contingency and ensuring your generals remain loyal and effective. It's like playing a grand multi-front war game, but every decision means real lives and the fate of entire regions. Beyond military reconquest, Justinian embarked on an even more enduring legacy, the compilation and codification of Roman law, resulting in the Remedies, Corpus Juris Civilis, which became the foundation of legal systems across Europe for centuries. One quirky tidbit about Justinian is his intense personal involvement in this legal work, often staying up late to review and dictate legal texts. You can picture him in the depths of night, hunched over scrolls, his eyes scanning dense legal precedents, meticulously refining laws that would govern millions. This intellectual labor, combined with his military and administrative duties, would leave virtually no room for true repose. Historians still argue whether Justinian's ambitious reconquests ultimately drained the empire's resources, leaving it vulnerable to later threats. And then there was his unparalleled architectural ambition, epitomized by the magnificent construction of the Hagia Sophia. In Constantinople, a feat of engineering and artistry completed in an astonishingly short time. You, the emperor, would be intimately involved in every aspect of this project, from its funding to its design and execution. The immense costs, the technical challenges, and the constant deadlines would be another major source of sleepless nights. So for Justinian, sleeplessness was the inevitable consequence of a prodigious intellect and an unyielding will constantly pushing the boundaries of what was humanly possible. His imperial bed was not a place of rest, but a nocturnal study, a silent planning room, where the blueprints for a resurrected Roman Empire were tirelessly drawn at the cost of the emperor's own peace. His wakefulness was the relentless engine that drove one of the most ambitious and transformative reigns in Roman history. After the ambitious but ultimately exhausting reign of Justinian, the Byzantine Empire found itself in a new era of profound crisis, where imperial sleeplessness became a matter of sheer survival against overwhelming external threats. Enter Heraclius, an emperor whose reign was a desperate, almost miraculous struggle to save the empire from annihilation by the Sasanian Persians and then the newly emergent Arab caliphates. You might imagine that only a man of iron will could lead through such times, but even for Heraclius, every night was likely haunted by the specter of impending doom, the relentless pressure of a fight for existence. It's like being the last defender of a besieged city, desperately trying to rally your forces against an endless tide of enemies, knowing that failure means the end of everything. Heraclius came to power through a revolt, seizing the throne from the tyrannical Phocas in 610 AD, just as the Sasanian Persian Empire was launching a devastating invasion that would conquer vast swaths of Byzantine territory, including Syria, Egypt, and even reach the walls of Constantinople. A mainstream historical fact about Heraclius is his extraordinary military campaigns against the Persians, often leading his armies personally in a series of daring and ultimately successful counteroffensives that pushed the Persians back and recovered lost lands. You as Heraclius would have spent years on campaign far from the comforts of the capital, enduring hardship and facing overwhelming odds. Imagine your nights in a cold, damp campaign tent deep in enemy territory, or perhaps within the besieged walls of Constantinople. The sounds would be of constant tension, the distant cries of battle, the anxious whispers of your officers, the gnawing silence of a starving populace, or the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of enemy siege engines. Your body would be ravaged by the physical demands of war, but your mind would be a whirlwind of tactical plans, desperate pleas for reinforcements, and the profound awareness that the very survival of your empire rested solely on your shoulders. You'd be strategizing not just for victory, but for mere existence. It's like being a general who has to win every single battle or your entire civilization ceases to exist. One quirky tidbit about Heraclius is his reputed introduction of Greek as the official administrative language of the empire, replacing Latin. This reflected the growing Hellenization of the Eastern Roman Empire and served to further differentiate it from the Latin-speaking West. For you, the emperor, this linguistic shift was part of a broader effort to strengthen the empire's unique identity in a time of crisis. Yet even as you oversaw such profound cultural changes, the immediate existential military threats would dwarf all other concerns, keeping your mind locked in a state of high alert. Historians still argue whether Heraclius's later retreat from the newly conquered Arab territories was a strategic decision or an inevitable consequence of an empire utterly exhausted by decades of continuous warfare. No sooner had Heraclius defeated the Persians than a new, even more formidable threat emerged: the rapid expansion of the Arab caliphates driven by the new religion of Islam. You'd find yourself facing an enemy whose speed and religious fervor were unprecedented. The territories you had just fought so hard to reclaim were now falling to this new relentless force. This constant, almost unbroken succession of existential wars would leave no room for peace, no opportunity for genuine rest. So for Heraclius, sleeplessness was the very essence of his reign, a grinding, visceral battle for survival that stretched over decades. His imperial bed, often a military cot on the move, offered no escape from the sounds of impending doom and the crushing weight of an empire fighting for its very life. His wakefulness was the unyielding vigilance that kept the Byzantine Empire from succumbing to the forces that had swallowed its Western counterpart, but at an unimaginable personal cost. As we journey through the final emperors of the Byzantine Empire, and indeed reflect on the entire span of Roman imperial rule, we come to the enduring, almost universal legacy of sleeplessness. You've witnessed how, from Augustus to Heraclius, the imperial bed was rarely a sanctuary of serene slumber. For the Roman emperors, the very act of holding ultimate power, of bearing the immense weight of an empire, almost guaranteed a restless night. Their specific torments varied from paranoia to conquest, from philosophical struggle to simple incompetence. But the inability to find true peace in sleep remained a constant companion. It's like discovering that the crown jewels aren't just beautiful, but also incredibly heavy, prone to giving you a persistent headache, and prone to making you acutely aware of everyone who wants to steal them. Even as the Byzantine Empire continued its long, complex history, its later emperors faced struggles no less intense than those of their predecessors. While we won't delve into each one, the theme persists: internal plots, external threats from Bulgars, Normans, Crusaders, and ultimately the Ottoman Turks. For centuries, every emperor, every empress knew that their reign could end abruptly, violently, at the hands of a rival or a foreign invader. The very air in the great palace would have hummed with whispers of intrigue and the distant echoes of war. Consider the overarching truth: the imperial office was a paradox. It offered unparalleled power, unimaginable wealth, and seemingly boundless authority. Yet it also demanded an unrelenting vigilance, a perpetual burden of responsibility, and a constant awareness of precariousness. You could command legions, build magnificent cities, and dictate laws for millions, but you could not command sleep. You couldn't turn off the churning anxiety about a barbarian invasion, a treacherous advisor, a failing economy, or a looming religious schism. Historians still argue whether the inherent nature of absolute power inevitably leads to paranoia and isolation, or if such traits were simply amplified by the personalities of certain emperors. A mainstream historical fact about the later Byzantine Empire is its eventual fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, bringing an end to over 1,000 years of Eastern Roman rule. You can imagine the sleepless nights of those final emperors, beleaguered, desperate, as the walls of Constantinople grew weaker and the Ottoman cannons grew stronger. Their sleeplessness would have been the purest form of dread, watching the inevitable approach of the very end. A quirky tidbit that spans the entire imperial era is the various methods emperors might have used to try and sleep. Perhaps a favorite slave would read to them from Homer, or a trusted physician would administer sedatives, though their understanding of medicine was, shall we say, rudimentary. Maybe they'd try counting sheep, though. For an emperor, it might have been counting legions or provinces or potential assassins. You can picture them trying every trick in the book, only to find their minds still racing, trapped by the relentless demands of the purple. Ultimately, the story of Roman emperors and their sleepless nights is a profound reminder that power, however absolute, rarely brings peace. It highlights the deeply human cost of immense responsibility, the way even the grandest triumphs can be shadowed by anxiety, and how the pursuit of order for millions can lead to profound disorder within the mind of one. The imperial bed, far from being a soft retreat, was often a crucible of worry, a silent witness to the relentless battles waged not on fields of glory, but in the private, tormented chambers of the imperial mind. As the echoes of their restless nights fade into the quiet and the weight of their world lifts from our imaginations, you can feel the calmness settling in, the vastness of empires, the struggles of rulers, the march of history. It all recedes now, dissolving into soft murmurs. Your own thoughts, once engaged by their sleepless burdens, can begin to drift gently away. Let the images soften, the sounds hush, as the ancient world recedes, leaving only a tranquil quiet in its wake. There's nothing more to worry about, no empire to govern, No legions to command, no plots to uncover. Just the simple, profound peace of the present moment, inviting you deeper into rest. Allow the quiet hum of the night, perhaps the gentle breeze from your fan, to lull you now. Let your breathing slow, your muscles relax, and your mind finally release its hold on the day's remnants. The emperors have played their part. Now it is your turn to find your peace, to surrender to the comforting embrace of true, undisturbed slumber. Sweet dreams.